See if I can do this without breaking it. My mom will tell you I never stand still very well, so we're going to try this. As I start, I first say how pleased I am to be here and say a word of thanks. Thanks that I have a chance to talk with you. But more importantly, thanks because we are a first-generation Bellarmine family. Our oldest, as you just heard, we have 2 at Bellarmine today, 2 more over at Lighthouse, Christian and Gig Harbor, who are on their way. Our oldest, Elias, is a junior, so he started at Bellarmine just a couple years ago. And as a first-generation family, I know that we owe a great deal of thanks to so many of you and so many families, many of whom have been part of the school for generations, who've supported and built the school that we now have a chance to come and be a part of. And we're very excited to be able to do that, so thanks to all of you for that. By way of a bit more introduction, I want to tell you just a brief story that'll give you a little more insights perhaps into my family. Our oldest, I mentioned, Elias, is a junior, so probably 11 years ago or so, when he was in kindergarten, they had a show and tell day in his school, in his class, in his kindergarten class. I guess it was actually more of a tell day, because what the teacher had asked him to do is come prepared that day to talk about a parent or somebody important in your life. Could be anybody. Most kids, I think, spoke about their mom or their dad or maybe a grandparent, but they could talk about any adult in their life. And so on that morning, and the teacher called my wife Connie that afternoon to tell us about this story. That morning when it became Elias's turn, the teacher said, "Elias, will you please come up to the front of the class?" And so Elias went up there, stood, and stared at the ground and didn't say a word. And so she asked him, she said, "Elias, who is it you're going to tell the class about today?" And she said when she asked him that question, he stood up straight and beamed and said, "My daddy." And then he looked at the ground and didn't say another word, just stood there. So she was trying to draw him out a little bit. And she said, "Well, Elias, why don't you tell the class where it is that your daddy works?" And at that question, he beamed again and he said, "Starbucks." And then stared at the ground. Didn't say another word. So she told us that she didn't know at that stage, as well known as Starbucks is, if a bunch of kindergartners, a bunch of 5-year-olds would understand that Starbucks is a coffee company. So she said, "Elias, please tell the class what it is that Starbucks makes." And she said this question completely threw him for a loop. He stood there and he wasn't bashful about it. The wheels were turning, and I don't know if 5-year-old brows can furrow, but his was, and he was trying to think, and she said she just gave him a couple minutes to think about that. She said it seemed like a long time. It was probably nothing more than a minute. And he stood there, and then all of a sudden she could see the light bulb go off, and he stood up straight and smiled, and he said, "Money." He said, "Starbucks makes money." That's my goal. As a former CFO of Starbucks, I've always loved that little anchor point. I often get the question, in my career with Starbucks, having been CFO for a lot of years, and even now as Chief Operating Officer, spend a great deal of time with investors, for example. And you go into an investor's office somewhere, anywhere around the country or in the world, and usually spend an hour with portfolio managers asking questions about the business and strategy and what was performance like last quarter and what do we think is going to happen next quarter. And you go through that, and more often than not, they save a question right toward the end. I think they've gotten through all their formulated questions they have about the business that they want to know from me, and then they'll say this question right toward the end. And the question is, what keeps you up at night? Now, it's sort of the catch-all. They want to figure out if the business executives have something that's keeping me up at night that they should know about to help think about their investment in the company in some way or another. What keeps you up at night? Sometimes they'll prod a little bit. Is it coffee costs that have been volatile this year, or is it wage rates, or is it global competition, or is it the issues in Russia and Ukraine and how that's going to impact your business? All those things they might prod a little bit. And no, it's none of those things. None of those things keep me up. It used to be when my kids were a little younger, if I wanted to dodge that question, I could say, "Oh, one of my little kids keeps me up at night." And then they get a little chuckle and I can move on to having to answer the question. One of the things I found though is the kids get older, and my youngest is 9 now, I can't actually say anymore that they keep me up at night. They all sleep really well. They're past that point where they wake up because of dreams. But here's something else I've learned. You go through that period of time when kids are young and they keep you up at night because they have to go to the bathroom, or they have a bad dream, or they need a glass of water. And then they get old enough where they're starting to sleep well, and everything's fine for a few years, and then you get to where you have older teenagers who will stay up later than I do, who are out late, who are at the football game or at the homecoming dance. Then you stay up late at night for a different reason. They keep you awake now for entirely different reasons. So I guess it is a little cyclical, isn't it? This week we had a conference in Seattle. We brought in all of the majority of our district managers from all around the world. There were 2,000 people in Seattle, Starbucks partners in Seattle this week. And Many of them, as I would do roundtables with them or visit with them, they want to understand about the business too on a broader scale, so I have those conversations. And many of them this week asked me the same question the investors do. They said, Troy, what keeps you up at night? What keeps you up at night? And I'll tell you how I answered. It isn't any of those things about the business specifically. What it is about leadership and talent. The single biggest issue and challenge we face and have always faced is, do we have the right leaders in place today in our business? Do we have who we need for next year? Can we grow around the world? And are we growing talent and really understanding the kind of characteristics and qualities of leadership that we need for today and in the future? That is the single biggest thing and challenge we face, and that is the thing that does keep me up at night. If there's anything I worry about from time to time, it is, are we developing that pipeline of people in the right way? For all the things on my plate to do every day in the big business that I'm a part of, the thing I spend far and away the most time on, more than anything else, is around leadership talent. It's on succession planning, it's on bench strength, it's on how to grow people from early in their careers to get the skills and capabilities they need to be what we need in the future. That's the single, far and away biggest place I spend my time. I have, as you heard or read in my bio, in addition to Starbucks, where I've been for a long time, I sit on a number of boards, corporate and non-profit boards in the US, boards around the world. I've had a chance to see organizations of all shapes and sizes, profit and non-profit, private and publicly held. While their businesses may be different, and the industries are different, and the challenges they face are different, there is without a doubt a common thread that weaves through all of them, and that is this need for talent and leadership development. If there's one issue that is common across, I think, just about every organization, whether it be schools or Fortune 500 companies, it is a need to grow leaders for the future. And that's a fundamental truth, I think, that I've experienced, at least in my time. I joined Starbucks a long time ago. When I joined, we were privately held, barely making any money, having to look under the couch cushions to get enough coins to basically build the next store. I mean, it was those early days at Starbucks. The big dream we had at the time was to think that maybe someday we could open up stores as far away as California. Now, at the time that seemed like forever away, and it was a warm weather climate. We didn't know if coffee was going to work in a warm weather climate. We have 2,000 stores in California now, so it's working just fine. But back then we didn't know that. There was a lot of things we had to think about as we were beginning to plan. Could we ship our coffee all the way to California and have it still be fresh? What are labor laws we know are very different in California? How can we learn about that and make sure we don't get ourselves tripped up on anything? We don't know the marketplace. How do we find stores and put them in the right locations as we go? All those things to worry about, and yet the number one thing we thought about back then that worried us that we had to plan for was, who's going to lead that marketplace? As we open up stores for the first time ever that far away, who's going to lead that for us? Who has the right capabilities in the company, or if we have to go outside the company, who can carry on and grow that business the way they should? Starbucks now is in 65 countries around the world. We have 20,000 or more stores. We deal with a lot of different kinds of issues today. Today we deal with the import-export issues in Brazil that we might deal with, and the problems in Russia and Ukraine, and is the Chinese government going to pick on American companies, and might we be a target of that, as big and important as China is for us? Entirely different and bigger sets of issues than we ever had to deal with back then. And yet I'll tell you, still today, the number one issue I deal with and we all struggle with is development of leaders and people. A common thread across sizes of companies, time, and I think it will never end. Focusing on the development and characteristics of leaders is just critically important. What I'd like to do today is spend just a few minutes on not broad-based leadership, because that's been well spoken about, and people a lot smarter than me have written all kinds of books and done seminars. What I'd like to do is spend a few minutes talking about a few what I think are underappreciated qualities of leadership. Perhaps those things that don't get much airtime, but I think should. Because so often I've seen leaders who have phenomenal skills at some of the easier things to recognize leadership. The ability to stand in front of a group, and the ability to articulate a strategy, and set a clear direction, and develop trust, and bring their teams along with them. Some of those things are critically important, by the way. I'm not dismissing them, but they're easier to recognize. They're easier to see, and often easier to know if a person has those. There are a few of the other qualities that are perhaps a little more challenging to see, but I actually think make the difference between leaders who are successful over time and those who don't do what we hope they will do. Let me start with one being dealing with ambiguity, perseverance, tenacity. I'll tell you, in my daily role, things are never very clear. It's not as hard to lead a team to where you need to go when the path is figured out, and the road is there and you've got a map. And sometimes we are blessed to face those kind of things in business or in nonprofit organizations. But more often than not, that path isn't so clear, or it's changing, or there's 5 paths, and we have to figure out which one to go. Or organizationally, there's a lot of different opinions on which is the right path to go down. Being able to deal with ambiguity and lead a team through ambiguous situations, make decisions, be decisive, that is a core, key element of leadership that we focus on developing heavily in our organization. And I think, and hope others will think about how do you recognize those skills in people, and how do you grow that kind of capability in somebody. Patience, tenacity, perseverance, being a learner, a grower. There's an old story about people being born leaders. I don't believe that for a heartbeat. I've never in my life met somebody who's born being a fully well-rounded leader. Yes, no question, there are people who have greater talents than others in certain aspects, and sometimes we can see that from a very young age, and we probably always experience those people. But fundamentally, more often than not, to really develop a full breadth of what it means to be a capable, well-rounded leader for an organization is far more than some of those things that we may initially see. And so an individual who has a hunger to grow themselves, to develop, to learn, to change, to recognize their own gaps, if they may exist, to be self-aware, those are the people who have an ability, and more often than not, are far more successful at growing and being sustainably strong leaders as time goes on. Leadership is not a development path that ever ends. I think it's even for the most powerful and significant leaders, the growth always continues if they approach it in the right ways. I have a chance to spend a lot of time with people earlier in their careers. Interns at different times, people perhaps who just joined Starbucks. I spend a great deal of time with them. And often because I've been at the company so long, they want to know about my path. And you know, they're right out of school and so fresh and excited to climb the corporate ladder. And I remember when I used to think about coming out of school and how I would grow and develop, and that idea of a corporate ladder was always out there for you. It was just common thinking that you could step into an organization and move your way up. And I don't think I knew this when I was younger in my career, but one of the things I've realized over time is that idea of a corporate ladder makes no sense at all. Ladders go straight up, and rarely do careers go straight up. Rarely do people grow and develop on a straight path upwards. Perhaps some do from time to time. It's not very common, and if they do, I actually feel a bit bad for them. I think they lose the opportunity to really develop themselves by being around and seeing a lot of things around them. So the corporate ladder idea, I just don't think works. More common now is you hear people talking about career paths. That one works a little bit better for me, and I think makes a lot of sense because a path can kind of wind around when you think about somebody's journey of growth and development. I think the best ones do wind around a bit and give exposure and visibility to all kinds of different skills and capabilities. But the problem I have with the idea of a career path is that a path you can put on a map and write down and you see it, and even if it's got twists and turns, you see where it goes. And it's got an end point and a beginning point, and you can chart your path through that. And I think so often career paths truly don't follow something quite that systematic. They take twists and turns. Things happen that people don't expect. You head down one path and it's not the right path, so you backtrack and go down another path. It's not quite as clear as a path. So the image I've always tried to tell people early in their careers, think about your development, think about your growth as a leader, as a person, as a maze. Now the maze I'm thinking about is that kind of maze where you have a cute little girl on the outside trying to work her way through to the little flower basket in the middle, or you have a little boy trying to get to the cookie in the middle, or a little dog trying to get to the dog biscuit in the middle, and you wind all over the place and backtrack. My personal favorite, by the way, is the frenzied business executive trying to get to the vacation in the middle. That's my maze. Keep working on that one. But it's the idea that when you step back, whenever you've accomplished, and I don't think you ever accomplished it, but have navigated your way through that career, that it is full of twists and turns, that create experiences, that give people the opportunity to learn, that develop perseverance because you hit the roadblock once in a while and you have to backtrack. By the time it's done, someone's wound their way all around. They may have stepped back out toward the outside before they head back in toward the middle. It's a far more, I think, reflective and a learning approach to development that early in the career I hope people start thinking about. Being prepared to take risks and chances. Go down that pathway that you're not sure if it goes to where you want it to go, but learn on the way. And if it doesn't get there, turn around, don't give up. Go down another path. Figure out how you can keep progressing yourself in your career, in your development, to whatever those goals and objectives may be. Dealing with ambiguity and perseverance and being a self-learner. Another one I'd speak about briefly is global awareness. And I'll explicitly call it global awareness as opposed to global experience, because those are quite different things. When I say global awareness, it doesn't necessarily mean that someone speaks 3 or 4 languages, that they've worked all over the world, that they've traveled extensively. Those things are very, very valuable, by the way. And I think we should always encourage that kind of growth and development in people. But global awareness can be born in people, developed in people, even when they haven't had those kind of experiences and they don't speak a lot of languages. It's much more about a framework, a mindset around awareness of differences in people, cultural differences, different ways people learn, different things that inspire and motivate people. Things matter differently to people in terms of how they think about their careers, how they think about their development, how they think about their own objectives. That's true in our organizations here. It's true in the U.S., and particularly when you navigate working in corporate environments around the world. The same is very, very true. It's having a sense of appreciation for those differences, an understanding of them, a willingness to learn those. That kind of global framework is critically important, because a leader who understands that people are different, they're motivated differently, will be far more effective at leading that team, whatever direction they may go, whether it's in a small business here in Tacoma or whether it's in a huge multinational that operates all over the world. Another perhaps underappreciated characteristic of leadership, and perhaps maybe it's not underappreciated, but it's so important to mention it, and that is a recognition that strong leaders must do more in their organizations than focus on making a profit. Now, in for-profit companies, that's the end state. That must happen. It's a part of the objectives that shareholders expect of us. But people expect more of organizations today. People expect more of leaders today. Leaders have to think beyond that explicit objective, whatever it may be. And by the way, I think that's true in nonprofits as well as it's true in for-profit corporations. Whatever that explicit functional objective that an organization has, or a team that somebody's leading has, a leader needs to know that their goal is much bigger than that. It's much bigger than that for the growth and development of the individual. It's much bigger than that in terms of what contributions they must make to the greater good, whatever that may be. So a leader who can recognize that part of their role is to lead a team and accomplish an objective, and part of it is to step beyond themselves a bit and figure out, how do I use this? How do I harness my own skills and capabilities in position to do something different in the community, in the neighborhood, perhaps for that one person that I'm leading. And maybe the last one I'll mention before I conclude this is belief. And again, this one probably does get some adequate amount of airtime, but a leader's ability to inspire belief is what can take a team from accomplishing the best they can do to going further than they ever could do. The best teams, the best sports teams, the best nonprofit organizations, the best corporate organizations in time have been built on teams that go further than what they ever could have thought they could have done to begin with. And a leader has to be able to create that inspiration, to create that belief. As I said earlier, it's one thing to be able to lead a team when the path is clear. It's another to be able to inspire a team to believe they can get somewhere when there's no pathway. When there's no pathway whatsoever, and when every wind is in the face to accomplish whatever that objective may be. There's a fantastic book I'll reference now. I don't have time to do it justice, but I encourage you to read it. It's called The Boys in the Boat. It's a true story. I knew the story for years because I went to the University of Washington, and it's a true story about the crew team from the UW back in the 1930s. The 8-oar boat, the racing shells. Now this team at the time, I'll just give you a few highlights. This team at the time was made up of the most unlikely of crew members. They came from all over the region, from poor communities, very difficult backgrounds. It was not a foregone conclusion that these would be premier athletes who would come not just to the UW to be able to make the team, but actually to ultimately go on to accomplish whatever they accomplished. And I'll give you a little spoiler, but the issue's not the end answer here, it's actually how we got there, which is why you still need to read the book. The ultimate answer is this team came together and against all odds not only raced their way to victory across the U.S., they won the ability through those races to represent the United States in the Olympics. And the Olympics in 1936 were in Berlin. As some of you may know, those were called the Nazi Olympics at the time. Adolf Hitler was in the stands watching the events as they unfolded. It was a very challenging time, of course, in the world. And the idea that an American company during all that global conflict could come in, American racing team could come in and face the odds they faced was probably felt insurmountable to me. There's a million stories about the great ways that this team came together and really rode as one and gave everything they had to each other and to their mission to be able to win that race and win gold, which they did in 1936, edging out the German team and the Italian team, of all things. But the biggest of all, the thing they had that nobody else had, was belief. Nobody believed they could accomplish what they did. They didn't believe they could accomplish what they did when they first were rowing on the shores of Lake Washington. And yet, as time went on, as they came to believe in each other, as they were coached and led to believe in what their goal was, as insurmountable as it looked, as impossible as it looked, they did believe. And they ultimately went on to achieve far more than they ever could have before. So those are a handful of things among a long list of critical characteristics that leaders have that I would encourage us all to think about. When we develop leaders in my company and in other organizations I'm a part of, we think a lot about how to look for those nuggets of leadership and grow and develop them. I'm very excited about Bellarmine as a school that's so focused on developing leaders for the future. And I think that's a fantastic thing. My guidance to anybody I speak with, and we think about this a lot at Starbucks, is make sure leadership development opportunities are not exclusive. They should be widely available to people. I mentioned earlier that I don't believe that leaders are born. I think they're actually made. I think they're grown. I think they're developed. And it's not always clear who those fantastic leaders of the future are going to be. Sometimes we can see it, sometimes you can't. So give opportunities to everybody to experience what it means to contribute to some form of leadership, to develop skills somehow. Because in time what we find, I'm sure what we find is, there are some people who are, to some extent, natural leaders and are to bring a lot to the table. There's a whole lot more people who aren't, who ultimately can be fantastic leaders. And those are the kind of people we want to make sure we're growing and developing and giving that chance and developing our own future. I will stop there. I want to thank you again for the chance to talk with you today and to be here. For all of those who have come before our family at Bellarmine, for your part in it. It means a great deal to us, and I'm excited to be able to carry that on. So thank you very much.